So there is your consent. You know that we're recording. Thank you. Okay. Hello and welcome one more time. This is Anti-Oppression Frameworks in Open Source, part of the Building Laterally event series hosted by the Digital Infrastructure Incubator at Code for Science and Society. I am Raya El Zain. I use she, also respond to they, beaming into your office or your car or your corner bodega or wherever you are from Philadelphia, which is Lenape territory. Thanks for being here. Closed captioning is enabled for this event. You can turn on the live transcript by pressing the CC icon on the bottom of your Zoom window. A reminder to all of our speakers and question askers that this works best when we speak slowly. I will quickly walk us through the general structure of this call and the tools that we're using. You'll notice we're in a regular Zoom meeting. Hi, little boxes. Feel free to do what's comfortable with your camera, but please do keep muted until we're in the Q&A portion. The other tool we are using is a Google Doc that's linked in the chat. Could you bump it one more time for us, Jess? We invite all participants to add their names and affiliation to the roll call on page 5 or 6 of this doc. This is a way of meeting and greeting each other in the absence of bumping into each other on the way to the bathroom. If you have announcements or resources that you'd like to share with the group, feel free to include those in the right column. The doc also hosts our agenda for today. You'll see a general plan on page 3, on page 4, our speaker bios, and on page 6, some support for the question and answer portion of this event. At any time, you can type a question into the Google Doc or into the Zoom chat. We'll collect them and hold them for the Q&A. If you would like to speak your question during the Q&A, you can type the word stack into the Zoom chat or use the raise your hand function, and I'll repeat those options when we get closer to that time. We'll also collect resources shared today in this doc. It'll stay open for 24 hours and then we'll close it and you can find it on the incubator website. A code of conduct guides our engagement here. It is linked in our Google document on page 2, replete with how to make a report. At CSNS, we strive to create safe, inclusive spaces where people can learn from each other. We are committed to providing a harassment-free environment where everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, ability, physical appearance, body size, race, age, religion, or work experience. We try to understand the difference between intent and impact, and our code of conduct is guided by those commitments. I will just add, if you tend to speak less, take space. If you tend to speak more, make space. We're using multiple channels in this event, so feel free to use what feels comfortable for you. Okay, I think that's everything in terms of those logistical introductions. Did I miss anything, Jess, Danielle?
No.
Okay, all right, then with pleasure, I'd like to introduce Danielle Robinson, the Executive Director of Code for Science and Society.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be speaking to you all. I'm Danielle. I'm the ED of Code for Science and Society. I've been in this role since 2017, 2018. We were founded 5 years ago with a core mission to advance the power of data to improve lives. Data, of course, is all around us, and its use by the entities that we interact with shapes our daily experiences. Now, you all know a lot has changed over the last 5 years. So what does it mean today to advance the power of data to actually improve lives? Well, we take a community-centric approach. We're really imagining a future where communities build research, data, and technology initiatives that grow global access to knowledge, that shift power to communities who have been historically harmed, omitted, or excluded. We don't think there's a data or data set or a data tool or a piece of software that's going to change the world. But when communities use technology for meaningfully empowerment, that has a chance. And so that's sort of the big picture framing of all the work that we do at Code for Science and Society. We do fiscal sponsorship. We run programs like the Digital Infrastructure Incubator and the Event Fund, which does have a call for proposals open. Perhaps someone could drop that into the chat. You can apply and we can give you money. And so these are the things I'm thinking about as I approach this work in open source, open data, open research, and the spaces around it. And so with that, I'm just truly beyond honored to be joined by today's speakers. These are people whose work I've followed for years, and I am, yeah, I'll turn it back over to Rhea. Happy to chat more in the chat or the virtual bathroom.
Thank you, Danielle, and thanks for making the space for this conversation. So I'm Rhea. I'm here as the program manager of the Digital Infrastructure Incubator. The Incubator is a new capacity building program for open source digital public infrastructure projects. As part of that program, we've created a public event series, Building Laterally, the Political Imagination to Support and Sustain Digital Infrastructure. This is our second event in that series. The first one was about labor and sustainable work in October, and we have an upcoming event that I'll tell you about at the end of today's conversation. So this is the second event, Anti-Oppression Frameworks in Open Source. Like many communities these days, the open source and digital public infrastructure communities are reckoning with accountability and how to build resilient community structures. Many, if not most, open source projects at this point have a code of conduct or a publicly accessible statement outlining a commitment to inclusion. Since I started at Code for Science and Society in May, I noticed a lot of chatter about not just having a code of conduct, but being able to enforce it. In other words, increasing attention is being paid to how project leaders and how communities will back up the commitments in their codes of conduct. It was these conversations, and I really felt like I came in the middle of something about enforcement in the absence of considerations about community that made me curious about how we got here. And so I'm really excited to be able to host this panel of very knowledgeable folks exactly on this subject. I have been asked to relay the regrets of Caroline Sinders, who had a last-minute conflict and couldn't be here with us. She sends her regrets to all of you and to her co-panelists especially. We've asked each speaker to talk a little bit about what they've seen over time in the language that we use to talk about value and inclusion in open source projects and the safety of open source communities. This could be what we've seen in moods and feelings attached with writing community guidelines, codes of conduct, mission statements, etc., or in the resources available to support and sustain those efforts. Alternatively, I've asked for reflections across projects in the ways in which different projects or communities have taken to the imperative or the urgency to address or reduce harm. What if these efforts or processes have been successful or less successful? How did communities and projects realize where their efforts were working and what did they try instead? The point of this conversation is to zoom out and contextualize a bit what is often felt as an imperative. One must have a code of conduct, or more recently, one must have an enforcement mechanism, to see like this desire, this quest for accountability more holistically, and to try and understand the different trajectories that this work is a part of. So that's the background here. And I'm thrilled to be able to host a panel with such a rich range of experiences. All right, so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who will be Coraline. Jess is going to shift up our pins so that we can focus on our speakers. Coraline Ehmke is at the forefront of the debate on ethics in open source. She's the creator of the Contributor Covenant, the first and most popular code of conduct for open source communities, and the Hippocratic License, an innovative open source license designed to promote and protect human rights. Coraline co-founded the Organization for Ethical Source and currently serves as its executive director. Welcome, Coraline.
Thank you so much, Rhea. Do you want me to start?
Please do, take it away, the floor is yours.
Okay, I want to preface this by saying this is not something that I talk about very often, and the reasons include my own personal safety, but in the context of this conversation and my pre-call with Rhea, I thought there might be value in kind of recounting a personal story of how I got how we got here. I got my start in software development in the early 90s, but the story of my work, my real work, starts in about 2013. At the time, I was very active in the Ruby community, and my speaking career was just starting to take off. And at that time, there was a huge debate. I don't like the word debate, but a huge debate broke out in the Ruby community about tech conferences and codes of conduct. The fundamental question was whether codes of conduct should exist at all. And as part of that fight, my friend and colleague Ash Dryden created something called the Code of Conduct Pledge, COC Pledge. People could sign it and pledge that they wouldn't speak at or even attend a tech conference without a clear and enforceable code of conduct. We might be surprised about this today, but there was serious backlash from conference organizers and others in the community saying things like a code of conduct isn't needed. There's no harassment problem here. Or if we adopt one, people will think that something must have happened to warrant it. They're just words on paper. They'll be used to police language. They'll hamper free speech. It was incredibly polarizing, and it got dangerous, literally dangerous for some of us. And in the midst of this conflict about codes of conduct at tech conferences, I realized that tech conferences are just one way, just one place where the community gathers, but our open source projects themselves, our GitHub repos and so on, are also community places. And so I was inspired to create Contributor Covenant, code of conduct for use in open source projects. And one of the hardest lessons I've learned since starting this work is that the status quo has an immune system. And the immune response to codes of conduct in general, and Contributor Covenant in my work in particular, has been very intense and very personal. In November of 2015, Eric Raymond, who's the co-founder of the Open Source Initiative, wrote a blog post entitled "Why Hackers Must Eject the SJWs." And he writes, the SJWs talk diversity, but like all totalitarians, they measure success only by total ideological surrender, denouncing others for insufficient political correctness, loving Big Brother. And then to get personal, it's clear that self-described transgender feminist Coraline Ada Ehmke wants to replace the cult of meritocracy with something else. And equally clear that what they want to replace it with is racial and sexual identity politics. 2016, Paul M. Jones, who's an author and prominent member of the PHP community, and incidentally a big fan of white supremacist Vox Day, wrote, as a tool of social justice, it is the author's intended purpose to give cover for threats and intimidation against those who do not support the author's politics. This is not the kind of behavior found in a free and open society. It is instead the behavior of a society that is totalitarian, even fascist with a smiley face. You're not allowed to disagree with the social justice proponents in any capacity. You're not even allowed to not care. You will be made to care. Later that year, 2016, the alt-right news site Breitbart wrote a hit piece on me with the headline, "Hackers in Revolt After SJWs Attempt to Impose Politically Correct Code of Conduct." In this brilliant piece of journalism, they write, the social justice warriors are engaged in an ongoing effort to spread their ideology, writing that Contributor Covenant gives SJWs a Stasi-like incentive to monitor coders' activities, and ends with the ominous statement, the silent majority of coders have not yet mobilized, but with the politicization of coding at hand, perhaps it's time for them to do so. 2017, I was invited to keynote a conference in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And about a month before the conference, I received one of the most frightening, specific, and detailed death threats of my career. The conference offered 24/7 armed guards and an armored car. And I decided it wasn't worth risking my life to give a talk at a Ruby conference. 2018, Washington Times editor Robert Stacy McCain wrote the classic Satanic Transgender SJW Wants to Control Open Source, in which he weaves an elaborate conspiracy theory, repeatedly dead names and misgenders me, mocks my mental illness, and even mocks my suicide crisis the year before, and accuses me of Satanism. In 2018, the Linux kernel adopted Contributor Covenant. And although I had nothing to do with that adoption, there was a huge wave of abuse, including the site linux.org hacked. And my docs, my home address, my social security number posted on linux.org. Late 2019, at the height of Mahente's No Tax Rice campaign, I was inspired to create the Hippocratic License, as Ray mentioned, an ethical source license tied to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this caused some trouble too. Once again, our friend Eric Raymond posted, this time to the official OSI mailing list, calling me a toxic Looney Tune who believes meritocracy is outmoded and in general a sinister supremacist plot by straight white cisgender males. The actual goal of the movement is to instill political officers on every open source project, banishing contributors for wrongthink. And he ends with, make no mistake, we are under attack. If we do not recognize the nature of the attack and reject it, we risk watching the best features of the open source subculture be smothered by identity politics and vulgar Marxism. And of course, Eric Raymond has also claimed that gays experimented with unfettered promiscuity in the 70s, got AIDS as a consequence, and the old gem, police who react to a random black male behaving suspiciously as a lethal threat are being rational, not racist. Co-founder of the OSI. I'm not sharing all this because I want sympathy. I'm sharing it because we need to understand that the progress we've made has had a real human cost. It's not simply an academic debate. And open source has always contended that it has a moral and ethical basis. The open source traditionalist, open, is absolutely considered an ethical stance. And then according to them, it's the only relevant ethical stance. But I don't believe that we should rely on people like Eric Raymond to define what is or is not ethical. If we want open source to truly be a force for good, we have to start with just and equitable communities and radiate outward to adopters, to users, all the way to the people who are most impacted by the technologies we create. When I launched the ethical source movement in 2019, Bruce Perrins, co-author of the open source definition, wrote that while he understood our intention, our efforts were misguided because ethics are slippery. They change from person to person and from place to place. But as technologists, we pride ourselves on our ability to solve hard problems. The existence of gray area is not an excuse to give up entirely. Rather, I see the gray area as an invitation for us to imagine, to collaborate, to iterate, to make mistakes together, to learn from them together, to make progress together. And that, to me, is the true hacker spirit and the true soul of open source.
Thank you, Coraline, sorry, came out wrong. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. I think we're gonna save, we'll save questions for the end. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our second speaker. Sydette Harry is a writer, cultural critic, performer, and far rock first generation Guyanese. She loves to ask questions that help us be as kind or as forceful as possible around media. She is slightly obsessed with information architecture, design, the difference between bias and context, AI, history, and performance studies. Previously, community lead and editor at large at the Coral Project, she was most recently editor at the Mozilla Foundation. She is Black Amazon Online. Welcome, Sydette. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I am so excited to be here, and more importantly, I am very excited to follow Coraline, because I think one of the things that is constantly lost in the discussions, especially the discussions that we have had since 2014, is how much that has shifted and how much we still have to go, specifically in respecting the idea of data and code as the results and care of people. I have always said that I lived my life at having created a middle out of very extreme experiences. So one of the things that I always will say, and it's in my bio as you heard, is that I am a first generation Far Rock Guyanese. My parents immigrated 6 months before I was born to still regarded one of the poorest neighborhoods, not in just New York, but in America. Also, I am an Ivy League graduate who graduated my very, very fancy schmancy college 2 years early, and was one of the first 5 colleges to ever get Facebook. So when it comes to the idea of who is an early adopter, who is an early user, I both magically fit the mold and magically don't fit the mold. but I've always been a user. And it is very interesting to see which is attributed to what aspect of my personality, what is often in my aspect of my life experience, because one of the things that I have said that is must be conscious in code for and programming and tech whenever we do it is that people bring their full selves to the experience. What people kind of snidely call identity politics is literally the realities of life. If I am going to do part of the reason I'm concerned with AI, not to the level of harder researchers, is when I had to sell computers, it was an interesting experience trying to sell watches that didn't recognize my skin tone. It is a very interesting experience to realize that your credit rating changes when you change zip codes. These are all products of code that precede what we have been experienced to. I've also had the experience of, because of identity and because of placement, not being accepted into what code and tech will say are the vanguards. I remember when everyone was on WikiLeaks and thought WikiLeaks was the greatest thing, and noticing the anti-Black, and racist, and also anti-LGBTQ bend of a lot of the discourse being told, shh, they're doing the good work, up to and until when WikiLeaks said they were going to compile a list of all of the journalists, and everyone was like, this is good breaking. And as someone who had survived Your Slip is Showing and had caught some of the edges of Gamergate, this just sounded like another attack. The back end of that is, it is also amazing to me how important open source community and community standards became in those moments. Because whether or not you say that you are for or against something, having a set of standards and having an agreement to those sense of standards, a consensual agreement, defines who we are. And just as much as they were enemies both within and without open source and tech who were very, very upset at having to recognize my humanity, there became allies, there became partners and comrades who were very, very good at understanding that while we may not agree on everything, if we agree about the basics of humanity, if we agree about the basics of engagement, and we agree about how we will engage with each other, it becomes clearer and more necessary to act. But the reality is this is built on people. As we are talking about material needs and looking forward from these other years, wealth inequality has gotten worse. Access has gotten worse. Reporting on efforts of diversity have gotten absolutely worse. One of the things that has come up to me a lot is that there were lots of promises to listen to Black women and center to Black women, and all of that happened. And then none of the reports that came out happened. People have published treatises on crypto and NFTs from 6 months ago than their promises to listen to Black women for years. And to be very frank, being able to support oneself, especially as a marginalized person with this economy, often means that you cannot engage in open source and community organization at a sustainable level in sustained births. And what I am hoping we begin to look at and what we talk about is being materially clear and examining our ethics in terms of what does it look like, not just for next year, not for the moment, or not for these pop-ups, but for the long term. The services we provide, the designs that we claim to make and looking at are not something that can just be fixed by tech or tool, but the spaces that we create. And if we are intentional and if we are kind and we are realistic, we can truly shift what happens. Because listening to Coraline Space, less than 7 years ago, people truly believed having someone say, I would not be racist in a space was the height of censorship. Now it's considered a basic for showing up. That comes from people. And we have to continue to focus on the idea that not only is open source the code and the tools and the characters we create, but the lives of the people who help us do that. And that must be something that not as centered off the side or just talked about in terms of the production aspect, but a generative aspect and moving towards that goal. Because more than anything, we're going to see people be very interested. And now that everything is a content creation or a community, people suddenly want the recipes and the secret sauce, but they don't necessarily want the people who are at the center of creating that. And that is something that open source in many ways helped grow, and I'm hoping will not let go of. And I will see the flow back.
Thank you so much, Sydette. Give the quiet applause. Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. Okay, I'll introduce our third and final speaker today. David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris is the founder of Amplify Restorative Justice, a digital platform built to share the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice. In his work, he leans on the training from his elders and his experiences working in Chicago schools, communities, and criminal legal settings to help folks understand restorative justice as a relationship-centered way of being and not merely a program for addressing harm. We're really excited to welcome David into our community today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a weird thing to be coming into a community to share things that I know very, very little about when it comes to open source, but to share the things I know a lot about restorative justice, these practices, these ways of being that really do apply to all humans in the ways that we are together. Before I start sharing, you know, in the chat, we invited folks to share where they're coming from in the world. And I didn't share. I'm just outside of Los Angeles, Southern California. But before I go farther, right, you have to acknowledge that the land that I'm on, the carpet underneath my feet, the floorboards, the foundation of the house, but then the dirt and all of this land is land that was taken and colonized twice, right? First by the Spanish and then by the Americans after the Spanish-US War from Tongva people, right? And most of us, I know there's some folks who might be outside of North America or Turtle Island, are on indigenous land that is unceded. And so as we're building these communities rooted in, you know, the cloud or the web and online, there's this acknowledgement that we as people still exist on spaces, on land that is deeply rooted in a lot of harm. And we know what happens a lot of the time is people who have been harmed or have witnessed harm or experienced harm replicate that harm in the things that they create. One of the people who I have learned so much from, especially in recent years, is Resmaa Menakem. He wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. He identifies as a somatic abolitionist. And he talks about how here on this continent, right, white people who fled centuries of oppression, torture, discrimination because of their religion, because of their ethnic differences in Europe, came here and replicated those same things. And so when we have folks here in the US and in other places, building spaces online, building projects, building communities, we're replicating things that we see. And, you know, that is in some ways natural, right? Humans are like partially epigenetically through generations coded to repeat their ancestors did. And when things are built into our culture, those are the things that we represent. Now, the vast majority of people on this call, right? I saw many of your faces, and I'm making assumptions based off of your names and your screen. For those of you who have aren't displaying your faces, and from conversations that I had with Rhea before this, most of you here are not folks whose intersections of identity fall within the most privileged spaces, right? Being cisgender, white, males, hetero, you know, and because of that, you know, these conversations are a lot more important to you. And so when it comes to enforcement, I think that there has to be this acknowledgement that yes, there are things that we do ourselves that are harmful, but we're mostly not talking about the people who are here in this room. So as I continue to share for the next little bit, keep that dual mind present for you, right? The things that I'm sharing are about you and your practice and who you are as you show up, as well as the people who aren't here who need this work. As Raya shared, my name is David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris. I think all of those names are important to share because it shares who I am. And I do this work to get justice for those ancestors who came before me, who have been harmed and oppressed by what I'm going to call white supremacist culture and coloniality. And I'm going to break that down in just a minute. And healing that work is restorative. Healing that work is not going to look like dominating white culture. And so I'm going to break down what restorative justice approaches to breaking down white supremacy culture looks like. When many folks hear the word restorative justice, they think about the criminal legal system or alternatives to punishment or harm. When it comes to words like enforcement of codes of conduct, many people jump to like, oh, punishment, kicking people out of community. Restorative justice as a movement got started in the late 1970s, but it's really relying on indigenous ways of being where there's this acknowledgement that we're all connected and we are all a part of each other. Words like Ubuntu or words like Mitakuye or Inlakech, I am another you, you are another me, we're all relatives, we're reflections of each other, are core organizing principles of indigenous people. And so when you recognize that, you realize that you can't throw anybody away because they are reflections of you. You can't kick somebody out of your community because they belong to you. You have to figure out how to work together to resolve problems. And it's so much easier to do that when those things are proactively agreed upon and there are relationships rooted in equity and trust to begin. I think so much about how simple it was when we lived in groups of, 30 or 150 or smaller groups. And now our world is much more complicated. And because of colonization, imperialism, and now late stage global capitalism, we're a lot more removed from some of those traditions in those ways. But doing this work is remembering all those things, right? How are we proactively building relationships rooted in equity and trust? And if those things aren't at the root of the way that we move together in relationships, it's going to be a lot harder to resolve conflict and identify harm when it happens. Because through all of this, we are not going to stop harm from happening. I'm going to say that again. We're not going to stop harm from happening. Humans are going to be in conflict with each other, but the goal is to harm each other in new ways, right? Because we've been able to navigate the old ways that have harmed people from generations, especially people who are sitting in identities that have historically been oppressed and marginalized. And so in order to do this, a restorative way of being is necessary, right? Restorative justice asks the questions, what happened, who was impacted, and how do we make things right or as right as possible, instead of a punitive way of being, which is talking about, what rule or law was broken, who did it, and how can we punish them? Punishment doesn't often solve problems at the root. It might stop harm in a given moment, but it's actually causing more harm and not often getting to the root. And so when we're looking at the root causes of questions, root causes of harm, asking those questions about what it takes to make things equal, make things right, make things fair, it requires people to be vulnerable, and people who have historically held power don't like doing that. And so when we're asking folks to do that, when we're talking about the Erics and the other folks whose names I'm not remembering, who have upheld and enjoyed the privileges of being quote unquote first in a space, right? Or being privileged with positions and power, there is this acknowledgement that, they have to feel quote unquote safe too, in order to make sure that we can have a conversation with them about what equity and justice and fairness looks like, right? People who have power, myself included, yourselves included, in the places that you have power, people who have something are afraid of losing all the time. And that's something that we can all relate to, but coming to folks with a fuck you, you messed up, you're canceled, attitude like is going to put folks on the defensive. And I'm not saying that there's not a space to call people out and identify harm. There's definitely time and spaces to do those things. But that's not what is going to resolve harm and repair relationships and conflict in a way that involves community and builds relationships and makes people stronger. That's going to result in alienation and feelings of resentment from some people. And sometimes that is the easiest way to navigate conflict for a given moment. I'm not saying that that's never the answer, but a restorative justice approach really asks us to think about what it takes to build those relationships proactively, in open source community. From what I've heard over the last few moments and have gathered over the last week or so of conversations and research, right? Y'all care about making sure that folks are able to contribute and making sure that there are ways that people can access projects, access communities, and being able to contribute in ways that are meaningful to them, in ways that they can show up authentically as themselves. And it takes changed perspectives to do that. And in this moment where many people are becoming aware of the different perspectives that they didn't know before, it can look like, we're going to do better. We're going to listen. We're going to make this commitment to X, Y, Z without really knowing what it takes. When I don't often work in open source world, but I do a lot of equity justice work in places like schools, right? And restorative justice is seen as this buzzword in this program as alternatives to suspensions, alternatives to punishment. And restorative justice is both just this process where we're asking those questions, but it's also this way of being, and adapting this way of being, acknowledging and valuing the interconnection between folks is a shift in how everybody moves. And if folks aren't willing to do that work, we are just paying lip service, right? People posting black squares, people putting out these equity and justice statements or Black Lives Matter statements. We will listen to Black folks, queer folks, disabled folks, without doing the work to include folks and really take their opinions and thoughts and needs into consideration. And so I am in some ways hopeful because these conversations are happening, right? And that is progress that folks, folks should celebrate. It's worth celebrating that these conversations are now being held in the open. Anti-racism is something that can be talked about publicly, but when we're talking about like the implementation of all those things, we're talking about people undoing 400 plus years of ingrained behavior that has been rewarded on this continent, right? And that doesn't happen overnight. And so holding both that hope and the enormity of this task in two hands is often where I find myself. And on some days, I'm really hopeful. On some days, I'm like, this is never going to happen in my lifetime. I'm just going to go take a nap right now. But through work, through relationship building, through making sure that we are not just canceling folks for their behavior and hoarding power for ourselves, replicating systems of dominance and oppression, it requires us to do that work that allows us to continue and sustain this work long-term, as well as building those relationships with others right now who are aligned with us, so we have more collective strength, collective power moving forward together. People talk about the silent majority. I don't think the silent majority are folks who are rooted in white supremacy and change. The silent majority are people who are scared to speak up, scared to stand up, because they don't know that that community exists. And this is y'all. There are more of you out there. I'm very excited to see where this goes and continue to be in dialogue through the rest of our time together. So I'm going to leave it there and ready to dive into all the discussions.
Thank you so much, David. Please join me in thanking David for his comments. Fantastic. Join me in thanking all of our speakers, please, for their reflections and the vulnerability and their own experiences that they're bringing to the table here. We really appreciate your willingness to share your experiences with us. Okay, so we're going to move into discussion and questions. As you're thinking about what your questions are, a reminder that you can type them into the Google Doc on page 6 or 7 probably is where the Q&A now is. You can also type them straight into the chat. If you would like to ask your question vocally, you can use the raise your hand function or type stack as Danielle just did in the chat, and we will moderate the conversation that way. Super. I'm going to kick us off with a question, and then I will hand it over to you, Danielle. I really appreciate the attention that all of you drew to the processes of change in your remarks, really pulling out the slowness of it. And I think that really reminds us that there isn't a fix, right? That we're not on the search for a fix. We're on the search to kind of understand how to break those patterns that David was talking about. And I think maybe part of that is understanding our individual roles in the ecosystem, right? Where we have power, where we move, how we hold that and wield that power. I'm wondering if all of the three of you have anything to add in terms of thinking about, you've talked about kind of where you see we're coming from, but I wonder if you might gesture towards where you think these processes are headed, and what maybe the next phase of these processes looks like from your position.
I'm happy to start. I'm very heartened to see that, especially over the past 3 years, that we are starting to focus on enforcement as a, the code of conduct in an open source project used to send a very strong positive signal that a community at least was going to try to make things welcoming, equitable, safe. But over time, as unfortunately codes of conduct have become more or less cookie cutter, we're seeing that enforcement is absolutely necessary, and actually code of conduct without an enforcement mechanism, without people trained to do community management, to do code of conduct enforcement, is actually more dangerous than a project without a code of conduct, because it creates it sends the signal of safety for an environment that may in fact not be safe at all. And I think that part of it is being addressed with folks. Mozilla has done some amazing work in this regard around community management and code of conduct enforcement best practices, and we are seeing those too. But I think that the next step in this phase of change is going to focus on transparent and representative governance, governance beyond enforcing community norms and community standards, and giving people, especially the people who are most affected by the technologies that we use, the people who see that impact on their communities or in their parts of the world, especially not giving a nod to consultation. Not giving a nod to well, we know best. We've seen these problems before and we know how to fix them, but rather distributing agency to the people who are most affected. And I hear that a lot in terms of like interrupting systems of oppression. The way you do that is to give the people who are most affected the agency to make decisions about the way technology is going to be impacting themselves and their communities. So I see governance as the next big fight here.
Thank you, Coraline. I think that's super important. Thank you for drawing our attention there.
I will step in first because I have to relay a conflict of interest. I've worked for Mozilla multiple times and currently work for Mozilla Rally now. And I think as a person who has technical community, but also very specific political alignments, the thing that is very exciting is that the thing that is also very distressing, because we have the opportunity for more access, more adoption. But with all of those moments, we also have the opportunity for co-option. So there are lots of people who are dedicated to things I loathe, who put out copy and code of conducts that sound very lovely. And if I was not very aware, I would miss the trick of almost to the point of places that are ads who are like, we're improving conversation on the web, but their entire dedication is towards making money for Breitbart and that sort. What actually does start to truly excite me is often located within open source code itself, and in some of the products that I see being built and questions that I see being asked, which is consensual tech. And I think the Data for Black Lives, Tamara Petty at Detroit Tech, and a couple others are really looking at, but the idea of letting and requiring, even in the writing, not just about how we conduct things, but how we build things, the ability for humans to opt out and opt in. And starting to build the places and spaces that talk about community as a choice, but also concentrate on building infrastructure as a thing you can participate in without having to sacrifice your ability to say no. One of the things that is most lost, I think, sometimes in the discussion of social justice work and access is we are looking, specifically being people on colonized lands and colonized lands built with slave labor and gender essentialism, is that one of the overarching principles of all kinds of oppression is the inability of the targeted to say no. And it's usually a small material thing, but watching more and many more spaces say that you don't have to say yes. You may not be disposable, but people have a right to limits and boundaries has not been an extended conversation, even in some of the most radical spaces. My mother was a political organizer, so I've been in them. To watch what happens when we start embracing the idea that you have a right to a no, and how emphatically and importantly that changes what happens when people do say yes, has been one of the most exciting things. And I think that it is a building block of what can happen as we move forward.
That's great, Sydette. Thank you so much for sharing that. David, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Just really quick tags on to what both Coraline and Sydette shared. I think the power shift is what we're really talking about. We're not looking for folks' words. We're not looking for folks' policies, right? We're looking for people to give up power. And where that happens, there will be equity and justice. Where that doesn't happen, we'll have more compassionate overlords, or overlords who say things with a more politically savvy way to say them. But until those things happen, we're not going to get very far. And there are places where that is happening. They're few. They're few. But progress is slow.
Thank you, David. Thank you to all three of you. Danielle had a question.
Sure. Yeah, I had two questions, and I think one of them's already kind of been addressed by Sydette and Coraline. I wanted to bring up the sort of whitening and milquetoast sort of code of conduct capitalism stuff that we see happening, where folks are adopting the language and perhaps even nodding to the processes, but there's no shift in power. But and you sort of addressed it, but my question is like, how can we keep pushing? But I think my next one is tied into that. What I see, I'm new to the ideas of restorative justice in our space, but having been involved in different code of conduct enforcement related issues, you always get to this point of like, well, whose job is it to do the work in the practical implementation? And it can't be the job of the people that were harmed. And that seems to be where I get stuck conceptually. So I would love to hear reflections from Sydette and Coraline and David on how our community can think more holistically about restorative justice while caring for and not making it anyone's job to necessarily go talk someone at Breitbart out of their political positions.
Thanks, Danielle. Panel, who'd like to kick us off? Coraline, go ahead.
David unmuted too. Go ahead, David.
Yeah. I'll jump in really quick because I think maybe there's some framing, and then y'all can come back in, tag team. When I think about restorative justice and people who have been harmed, and people who are causing harm, one, tangentially, oftentimes there's harm happening both ways. But in cases where there's not, when there's a very clear person who's causing harm and a person who has been harmed, right? The priority before bringing those folks together to try to restore that is to make sure the harm stops first, right? And if that can't happen, we're not going to go into that restorative process. We're going to go into something that's protecting somebody who has been harmed so they're not being harmed anymore. That might look like temporary exclusion from a community, or temporary separation for whatever time, until somebody is willing to come back into community based off of the agreements that our community has agreed to uphold to be in relationship together in a good way. The logistics of that look very different, but restorative justice isn't advocating at all, or doesn't necessitate rather, that a person who has been harmed or is actively being harmed be the ambassador to extend that olive branch to the person who's causing them harm. We have community for that, and y'all can talk about some of the specific ways that could look.
Great. Thank you, David. Coraline.
Yeah, I do want to say that with Contributor Covenant 2, which I believe was released in 2019, I was really inspired by some of the work that that Mozilla was doing with their code of conduct enforcement ladder. And David, I think it kind of resonates with some of the things you said. It's not a matter of if harm will happen, but rather when harm will happen and how it will happen. We have to plan for those things. But I've tried to I've sort of made it a point over the past few years to try and get something actionable out of even the most vitriolic kind of backlash. And one of the things that I saw that was a criticism of codes of conduct from the beginning was that I'll say one bad thing and be kicked out of a project permanently, right? So of course that's ridiculous. Of course that's not going to happen in any community that actually cares about things like this. But the code of conduct enforcement ladder that Mozilla put together, I thought was very much aimed at, first of all, addressing the harm that has been done, but also about how to get the person who caused the harm to become a better member of the community, to get to address the harm and let that influence their future actions. So with Contributor Covenant 2, I tried to bring that framework, start bringing that framework into bear, because it's really, and David, I'm very inspired by what you said. It's very much a matter of like healing the community. You're not ejecting people for community unless something really heinous happens, but rather finding a way for them to repair the harm and improve their behavior in the future and reduce harm in the future. So that's something I believe very strongly in, and I'll be looking for help from a lot of folks next year as we start to work on Contributor Covenant 3.
Thank you, Coraline. Go ahead, Sydette.
No, one of the things that I think is beautiful is that we have to acknowledge that the first thing is that we have to stop the harm. I think that too often we get dragged into, especially as marginalized people or people being harmed, it becomes a rhetorical discussion of whether or not this is harm and things like that. And there is a discussion of whether your humanity or whether that was challenged. And it works, and it works in a lot of ways there in terms of especially dealing with abusive members versus people who have good intents but bad impacts. Is that one of the things that we often struggle with is that people who are very good at being abusive and intend to be abusive sometimes are the best verbal litigators ever. They are the best verbal litigators, and they have the biggest understandings, and they study deeply. So one of the things that I talk about is very practical things, and it comes from modeling being willing to be wrong and modeling being willing to not understand. Because a lot of that comes from this belief of those like deep fractures of this deep thing of I will be exiled and thrown out if I'm wrong, where one of the first things it says there are worse things in the world than being wrong. also you have a need. Most of these things, you have a need, which is why you did what you did. So I want to understand the fundamental need. And a question I love asking, usually to a point of distraction, is what do you need that made you think that acting that way was the best way to get it? And it is very important because in best case scenarios, you have people who are literally learning new verbiage and language and new modes of interaction, and asking everyone to be perfect every time is just not possible. But it's also a great neutralizer because we cannot behave as if they're not bad actions or bad actors. And that there is a very, very clear need to value the work of community building, of interactions, of building that space as work. That there are, especially for open source and other projects, that you sometimes need to have a project manager. You need to have someone there who has that responsibility. And usually you need to have more than one person. It is a distribution model, and bringing about learning different disciplines. And it is very interesting that often the disciplines that map onto what work was unhonored or unpaid in revolutionary settings and in capitalist settings, and all of that care work is also unvalued here, but it is necessary. And starting to work very clearly on making that materially part of that, as well as being a need, not just a want. You need to be respected. You need to have certain needs fulfilled. And then when they're not, you will do things to get them fulfilled, or you'll cause harm either to yourself or others. And starting to bring out that language, but also bring it out under the sense of you're not going to be penalized for being human. And it's hard work, and it's long-term work.
Absolutely.
If I
Sydette,
can just
thank
add,
you.
I'm sorry, can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah.
And Sydette, I love what you said. I think one of the problems that we face, especially in open source, is that engineers have been taught our entire careers that no problem is intractable if we sit down and think about it hard enough. And I really think the problems we're facing in terms of community management, community organizing, all these things in open source, these are not unique problems. These are not things that are new because of the technology. These things are as old as human civilization. So why do we insist on trying to figure things out ourselves rather than working with and collaborating in a meaningful way people who have been doing this work, people who maybe are not in the online space, or at least not engineers. There are entire fields of study about how these things work. And I think we really need to do a better job of recognizing where our expertise ends and where someone else's expertise begins.
Absolutely, Coraline. I couldn't agree more on that point. I don't want to put them on the spot, but Emma Irwin is here. We've mentioned many times the kind of efforts that they've put through, that they did at Mozilla. Emma, would you like to add anything? We have a lot of folks on this call who've been instrumental in building out different efforts in the spaces that they're a part of. We are in the conversation portion of this of our time together, so please feel free to chime in. Emma, would you like to say something? Thanks for being here.
It's really nice. I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't been on camera today, so it's nice to see you. I'm just the conversation has been really great. Like, I have goosebumps thinking about like all the types of things that we can be changing. I'm really just here to learn, I guess. If I could just pull out a couple things that I thought were kind of compelling for the work that we need to do next. And I also has got me thinking about Kim Creighton's intention without strategy is chaos. I love that that statement, and I think that's kind of what we're getting to here a little bit. It's like our intentions have been good, right? Like we've tried hard, and we've built things, but we're still missing some like strategy. I don't even know if that's the right word, but what is a prerequisite, I'm thinking, for a code of conduct? What are the steps that should exist and be consistently visible that show that equity and that trust is being constantly prioritized, and that the learning Sydette was talking about, willingness to be wrong. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's, for me, that feels like the kind of the next big challenge. What is the prerequisite Right now we look for code of conduct, and that's great, or we're all saying, and I've been saying it too, enforcement is really what matters, but now I'm realizing that's the wrong language. So, it's consistently evolving, and I'm really inspired by learning, especially the restorative justice work. So I think it's really exciting. I think we're getting something here. I don't have anything specifically to say other than that. What is the prerequisite? There's just something missing, is really all I have to contribute today. But thank you for this call and for all the speakers. It's just been amazing.
Thank you for sharing that, Emma. Actually, I think the next question that we have in the doc kind of builds off of that. Kaylee is asking, she says, I would like to understand more about how restorative justice looks when offenders are recalcitrant. My concern is seeing extensive care work being done in multiple modes by the people being harmed, with limited return on this investment and limited awareness of all the other folks who've also tried to guide and intervene without success.
Let me Google recalcitrant really quickly.
When they're stubborn or like unwilling to move.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's tough. And I think like that's why so much of that proactive community building is so important, right? So there are relationships that already exist with people who can talk to each other. I think Coraline talked about like the need for like transparency and leadership and openness, and like what that entails is like a lot of community dialogue and agreement about what we will do when these things happen, and so having those processes in place is really important. Knowing that who the people are really important, who are equipped to have these conversations is really important. You can't force somebody into being restorative. You can't force someone to take accountability. Accountability is about you and yourself, right? Like, what are you going to uphold? You can be accountable to a community within the context of, the relationships that you have in your community. But at the end of the day, it's like, what are you willing to do? If you feel safe enough in that community to be able to go and talk about the places and the times that you've messed up or caused harm, that is being accountable. But providing those spaces and having people know what those are ahead of time is so important. I can't stress that enough.
Deeply being aware of your own limits.
Mm-hmm.
I am not the person, and that's often when people ask me, like, for certain things. Community moderation is something I do from love, and it's something I always do from partnerships, but I try to not make it my life work, because the way my own temperament and life experience is set up, it is not fair to do that to other people, because that I tend to take a very hardline response to it, and some of that is deeply classed. I'm coming from a working class background of a very specific ways, and there are times when you literally just have to, if a person will not change, this becomes dangerous to me, I need you to back up. And that is, I think, often one of the biggest failures is that people often are trying their best, but we feel you don't have to do everything. And we do not have enough conversations about sometimes intentionalities, intentionally knowing I'm not the person to do that. And that's why we set up a larger space for other people to do that, and we partner. And I also think that sometimes, this is very much from therapeutic speak, is that sometimes a hard no is one of the most loving boundaries that people can give. And you can't be here isn't the same as you can never be here. And you can't be here right now is not the same as you can't be here ever. There is a desire for an acceleration for time, especially connected to coding and tech projects. With open source, often there is a paradoxical thing where, because we are working for free and we're working towards social good, we often feel like we have to outperform commercial or capitalist ventures to prove we still need to be here. And that is a thing to address. But there's sometimes where it's just like, we have to admit that we will take more time. Because one of the strongest things that is there's a Twitter account, also a Instagram account called abolish_time that I think is really true. But looking at how we even view time has deep factors into what we believe is possible. And sometimes starting with that is just that you don't have to have every single moment, but we need to take this moment, or this moment is not the same as the moment before, but you have space to play with that is super important.
It strikes me that a lot of what we're talking about, at the core of what we're talking about, there's a lot of, I think trust is one of the core components that I don't think we've called out explicitly. But code of conduct enforcement is about trust, right? And institutions, even an open source leadership team, they have to extend trust to people by default, be ready to address when that trust is betrayed, but they have to themselves earn the trust of contributors. And I think a big part of what we're seeing now is that the white Western trust model, and the trust model in open source, is very transactional. You are rewarded with social currency for consistently delivering. Whereas a true community, and I don't mean I bought a couch and now I'm part of the couch community, but rather the true communities that we feel a real sense of connection with, those are based on affective trust. They're based on relationships. And I think that shift from a very transactional model to more of a values-based model, to more of a community model, requires us to rethink our trust models as individuals and also as community leaders.
It's so true, and again draws attention back to the longue durée, the long duration of these processes, and how there isn't a thing that can happen today or tomorrow to fix it. That these are investments that we make in time. The next question in the doc addresses this question of time. Jess asks that she finds that a lot of open source groups don't have a full process in place for handling their codes of conduct until an issue arises. Do you have any advice, panelists, for these kinds of situations where groups are building the plane while it's flying, as it were? I mean, you've all highlighted a little bit about how things need to happen slowly, but what happens is there advice that you have for when it needs to happen quickly? And I see you, Emma and Hawk.
I don't like that metaphor because building the plane while you fly it, it's not what most people do. Like, people who are doing that are probably going to crash and burn. So land the plane, right? And so I love that we've touched on urgency and time in the last little bit, because we actually do have the time, right? In many cases, I know there's a lot of excitement around getting projects done or doing those things, but if we stop and facilitate these conversations and build that trust, it's going to make our work down the line go so much faster, because we've addressed these things and we know how we're going to move forward with them before that. So if you're in the middle of something, right, it's okay to stop. And I don't know the stakes of your project. I don't know the stakes of your community. But if it's important enough to y'all and the people there to take a pause and say hey, we're out of alignment with the way that we're in relationship with each other. Let's get back in alignment. And this is kind of going on to one of the questions that I saw in the chat around words like love. You don't have to use words like love and woo-woo and healing and all that. It's what is the relationship? What is the working relationship here? We're out of alignment and things aren't going well. People aren't being heard, valued, and seen. So how can we fix that, right? How can we get our plane engine running, right? How can we get our wings set in the right place? We do have time. White supremacy culture wants us to think about this urgency, and there is such a need to solve these problems, both the problems of equity and justice and the problems that any project is working on. But how would you rather move through a project begrudgingly with the people who like you could be in like really good relationship with, and take a little bit more time, or like begrudgingly like just get through that and like, I never want to work with those people again. So those are some thoughts.
To return to something I said before about like don't solve from first principles. One of my colleagues and a fellow board member at OES, Astrid Counté, describes herself as a sociologist technologist. And one of the things that I've learned from her is that with her academic background in sociology, is that if you're going to embark on a research project, a sociological or anthropological research project, part of your proposal has to be how you're going to deal with the harm that is created from your research. And again, it's not if, it's when, right? And for a proposal to be approved, you have to have a comprehensive plan for harm reduction and harm mitigation. What if we did the same thing with technology? What if we thought, like Sydette talked about, the people that don't give their explicit consent to have their data collected, to have any of these things happen. And I think a lot about what I call collateral users, which is the people, not just the users, not just adopters, but the people upon whom technology is used, usually without their consent. We have to think all the way through. Harm reduction does not stop at the borders of our open source communities.
That's so true. Thank you both. We have a couple more questions that are in a similar kind of similar framing, I think. I think this is Justin who's asking, as we reframe or rethink what enforcement and restorative justice means in open source spaces, what kind of advice or guidance do you have for centering love or loving kindness in difficult situations? And I think I'm gonna combine with Emma's question. Sydette mentioned just because you're not welcome now does not mean you are not welcome ever. And I've heard that considering capacity is something to think about with restorative justice. Someone's capacity may be limited for periods of time and should be considered. So does it make sense to consider those two questions together, panel?
I really want to touch on something that was said, because one of the things that I always say, and I've said in talks before, is that the most glaring indicator that something is going to go terribly wrong with boundaries and or care in any situation, business or otherwise, is if somebody says we're just like a family. Because it is one of the number one things that I note is that families are often where our first experiences of harm are, and our first experiences of being gaslit out of that harm, or just not having to deal with that harm, or having people, or dealing with people who are who have been so acclimated to certain kinds of harm, they have no idea that they are harmful. But what the other thing family has is that there is often very few ways for you to escape outside of the long term. And there is no relationship I want to be with, especially once we are all consenting adults, that makes other people feel like they do not have the ability to set their parameters and the ability to say no. And the flip side of that is that even in great families, in some of the relationships where people are truly loving and caring, there is an understanding that you have your own space, you have your own ability. And I think that that is a really big part of that. The reason that metaphor is so troubling, but so common, is that families often have a way of layering on top of it this realization that you can't say no, or you feel obligated. And when you push that onto people, you want to make sure that everything we do here is a choice. You're presented with a choice, and we're choosing to be here together. You could be anywhere in the world with us, but you're here with me tonight. So how do I make sure that that investment is a choice you're glad to make, or a choice that you can function under for the work that you are glad to do? And that is something that is very that is something about capacity that we don't think of, because we build on a model that kind of sustains this idea that you don't have the capacity to say no. We're never going to get good mental models or good functional models for building good capacity. And I think that is one of the hardest things to work through. Like, how to, and I keep coming back to it because it is so hard for people, but the coming back to that no is not, is simple, but it is not overarching, but it has to be fixed. Like, it's okay for you to say no. And sometimes the best thing you can say to someone is no. So that's how we get good benchmarks.
Thank you, Sydette. Do you want to add anything else to that?
I was listening to intently. Now I'm trying to synthesize the response between these two questions. So give me just one moment.
Sure. I have one final question maybe to put to the whole panel, and maybe we can do one more round and that will send us off. My question is, let's just make sure there's nothing else in here. Yeah. Does it matter what our politics are? Can say a libertarian and a communist achieve the same goals when it comes to this work? Is there an apolitical goal around inclusion that we can actually work towards? Or do we eventually need to decide that there are specific ways we hope to distribute resources and power, articulate them, and then back up those commitments?
Nobody's going to ever, I will not honor any project that forces one person to have to justify their human existence to another person. That is a Sydette line, that's a hard line. But for me, we can have lots of philosophical discoveries. I was in philosophy and theater, it's great, it's fun. Love me reading some Plato. I love reading about Stoicism and non-dualism, and I'll even go back and read the original Hindu because I think it's important. But when it becomes if I don't agree with you, I get to spend time asking you to explain your life to me, that's a hard no. Because the question becomes, are you here to do the job, or are you here because your participation in the job gives you a leverage of power that makes certain people have to put up with you? And I also think that there is, and that's just for me. With that said, there are times when I think, if we are just here to do a thing, as long as the way your existence within that space and without that space aren't counterintuitive or I want to say counter-revolutionary, but that is exactly what I'm not trying to say, but that's just my own background of saying things, but like counterproductive to what we're doing. The question that I asked before is that who is asking about other people's political desires and distinctions in what venues, and why did it become important? Because if it is truly just about doing the thing, why does that come up? And do we have spaces in place for be like, look, we're doing this, and for other spaces, we need to move on to other things, which are things that I might involve professionally or for larger projects. But for my smaller projects, there are certain things where it's like, I'm not arguing with you. I will, and I have been the moderator where somebody said one, and this is the thing about being very clear about what is the actual stakes, because you will not be permanently exiled for saying one wrong thing. But if you become a badgering presence about somebody else's humanity, I'm going to click that button and bounce you without a second thought. Me and you, if I have that power, will have a separate discussion, but it's not something I'm going to subject someone else to. But also, if we have done our community properly before, or properly have done our work properly, you knew that before you start.
I think even when politics aren't explicitly being talked about, something that I am the only person I hear saying this, open source was founded by libertarians on libertarian principles. And the libertarian principle that most intersects with open source is absolute freedom. And the principle of absolute freedom is incompatible with existing within a community, because actions have to have consequences. You have to be accountable. You have to be responsible. And again, this transactional model where none of that matters. I've literally had people say, someone's a Nazi, but their code is good. I'm still going to merge their PR. Why is that? What kind of and it comes down to privilege. I'm sure I hate that word anymore. It's overused, but what kind of privilege do you have to say you're not political, which of course is a political stance. All of these things are political, and to ignore the politics is to ignore a very important part and a very major component of human civilization in our societies.
Thank you, Coraline.
Oh,
David,
man.
go ahead.
Yeah. I think, capital P politics versus lowercase p, how people are together, is an important distinction to make, right? Because calling somebody, like acknowledging somebody's pronouns and using the name that they just told you to call them, right? That's human respect, right? You don't have to believe XYZ about who is what, and like whether you're going to call someone by their birth name or their name that they were assigned at birth, or all these things. Like if I tell you that in this relationship you call me this, like call me this. I don't care about your capital L, capital R, left or right politics. We can work together. But when it comes to issues around justice and equity, I think that's up to individuals to decide, to kind of speak to the capacity, like what you can tolerate, what is safe for you, what is safe for your community. And there's no like clear answer to that for me. Because of the world that I've curated for myself, I don't mostly work with people who are in opposition, who would have a hard time saying the words anti-racism or we need to dismantle white supremacy culture. I understand that your world is different. But I also know that, you can only do this work, restorative justice work, with people who are willing to do it. And if people aren't going to be there for that, you can't talk them into it. And so when there's political misalignment with things like, human respect and dignity, like we're just not having that conversation, and we're just going to find another space to do this work separate from each other. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Perfect. I think that is a fine place to wrap us up. Please join me in thanking our marvelous panel today. I think you guys have given us so much to think about, and spoken with so articulately and with so much passion. Thank you for being here. I want to thank my colleague Jess for her support running logistics on this call, and the whole team at Code for Science and Society. Our next event, Visions of Mutual Power, is coming up on January 19th. Many open source public interest projects identify as duocracies, where contribution and participation guides a project's trajectory. This panel asks, what kinds of power can duocracies build and hold? And panelists are going to be offering examples from other movements that have mobilized the structure of mutual aid towards radical solutions to the questions of community health, safety and inclusion, and sustainable work. We're really excited to be able to continue the series with a few more conversations. You can find them on Eventbrite and on our website, which Jess has just bumped again. Well, the last thing that I will bump is a link to a survey for this conversation. If you would please check out, click through to that survey. And that's all. Thank you to you for being here. We hope to see you at the next event. Take care.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, everyone.